Hello, everybody. Good morning and good afternoon to different people in different countries. It's a pleasure to have you all here. Uh, First, I'd like to thank you, my friends and colleagues, if I can call you friends, Lorena, Catherine, Fernanda Duarte, Daniela, and Carlos Henrique. Uh, so, um, I'll start. I'm not going to ask. I was telling people I'm very shy because I haven't spoken English for quite a while, but that's the way it should go. Um, the way it works here, our Viva, we have Guilherme is going to have a short presentation, 20 minutes presentation. Then we open to the jury to present their comments and questions, inquiries. After each member, Guilherme will have a brief time to answer. Shortly, he will answer the question. It's not, if you can actually enter into a dialogue if you think it's important or necessary. But we can always, at the end, come back to ask any further question if necessary as well. And after that, the jury gets on our own to decide if he pass, if he needs any correction in his work, or if he fails. And then we tell him the decision of the jury. So first, then just make the introduction. We have here with us. I'm very glad you all accepted to take part in this Viva. Catherine Wills from the University of Plymouth. Lorena, who is a colleague studying at the UFMG, but is now a professor at Lund University in Sweden. Fernanda Duarte, that I just learned now, she was at UFMG, but is now at University of Carolina.
North Carolina State University.
She's moved there. So Daniela, that is an independent researcher and artist, used to be at USP. And Carlos, who is a colleague here at UFMG, School of Belas Artes. So Guilherme, now it's you.
Okay, so good morning or good afternoon. I want to begin by thanking the members of the evaluating committee, Professor Catherine Willis, Professor Lorena Melgaço, Professor Fernanda Duarte, Dr. Daniela Cuccia, Professor Carlos Falsi, and my supervisor, Professor José Cabral. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here today. And I would also like to thank my family, friends, students, and professors who are watching this Viva from places as close as the next room or across the ocean. So I prepared a text to guide me. I will try to be as brief as possible. So I will share a translation of what I will be saying in Portuguese for, for my colleagues in Brazil that are not so familiar with the language. So let me share my screen. Everybody's seeing?
Yeah, okay.
Okay. So to begin, I must say that the process of writing this thesis was delightfully unsettling. Without feeling exaggerated, I can say that at the beginning, this work was based only on an intuition about the possible intersections between immersive technologies and architecture. It took me longer than I thought to establish the research aims, which is to discuss from a phenomenological perspective the immersive experiences in architecture and VR, relating the production and experience of immersion in both mediums, seeking to disclose the effects and cognition that VR can offer, and understand the limits for the effective incorporation of VR into architects' design processes. The thesis is organized into 6 chapters, 2 intermissions, and a brief prologue, an introduction, 4 theoretical chapters, a conclusion, 2 practice studies presented after the 3rd chapter, and a personal preamble before the introduction. After the introductory chapter, where the aims, objectives, and methodology are presented, is the chapter An Introduction to Technology and Immersion. This first theoretical chapter discusses the notion of technologies of immersion by analyzing each term separately to understand if technologies of immersion is an adequate term to my discussion. The enactivist approach to cognition is presented, establishing the notion of a subject that develops her or his understanding of the world through and from the coupling of her, his body, with the world. Throughout this chapter, I try to demonstrate immersion as a quality of a subject's experience, meaning that there is no immersion without an immersed subject. As a consequence, the term technologies of immersion seems inadequate. I propose the use of technologies for immersion, relating the technologies that can be coupled with a subject serving as a medium for stimuli, and designed to make a subject perceive her, himself as immersed. This definition is aligned with Sloterdijk's proposition of an art of immersion, announcing that the technologies for immersion can be approached as a practical investigation of the many aspects involved in experiencing immersion. Finally, I argue that the discussion of this thesis will be guided as much as possible by what experience can disclose, or to use Heidegger's term, what it can bring forth. Thus, disclosing is an interesting perspective to analyze the entanglement between technologies for immersion, the art of immersion, and an immersed subject. Being the latter, one who crosses and is crossed by the immersive experience, and who, in this process, is also affected and affects it. The following chapter, the subject within immersive technologies, discusses the modes of engaging with technologies for immersion, studying how subjects can interact with these technologies. The modes of engagement are co-determined by the subject's body and the very design of the technology. The study of these modes will be approached from the standpoint of affordances as proposed by Gibson. An affordance of a particular element of the environment has to do with how a subject perceives the element regarding her or his own body, tracking possibilities for acting. The examples presented were classifying according to the movements afforded when a subject was coupled, starting with those exemplars where subtle movements were afforded. Then, the exemplars where the movement was within reach were presented, and lastly, those which afford the subject to displace across, within, or around. At the chapter's end, I focus on understanding how the movements afforded by the exemplars were fundamental to disclose some strategies to mobilize perception, deepening our understanding of how perception works. And finally, this chapter was crucial to assert the relevance of studying the experience of immersion and the experience of producing the conditions for immersion. Then the two practices were presented. At the first glimpse, they may seem disconnected from the thesis, but they were essential for further the discussion. The production of these practice studies enabled the investigation of the production of immersive experiences in VR from a first-person perspective. In the beginning, it was a naive attempt to include myself in the research, but with my supervisor's help, I realized the potency of this experience to support and inform my theoretical discussion. To produce them from very personal and intimate experiences was an attempt to avoid the production of architectonical spaces per se, which could lead me to produce inert spaces that would serve mainly as showcase of the technological possibilities of VR. Instead, the production of practical studies from and about the same body produced a chiasm, a tangle between the subject producing and the thesis subject in a double sense, with the theme of the thesis and with the subject researching. In chapter 4, the atmosphere of immersion, experiencing architecture and VR, a discussion on the similarities and differences between the immersive experiences of VR and architecture is presented. The concept of atmosphere as something that mediates, situates the perceptive experience of space as something that happens between a subject and an object. The atmosphere is related to this first impression of a place, and it's noteworthy that the same space can produce distinct atmospheres depending on the subject. Even so, the notion of atmosphere can expand the possible understandings of what architectural design can comprehend beyond just solving problems. In a sense, to include the production of atmospheres as part of our discussion on immersion in architecture opens up the possibility for the designer's body to participate in designing. To recognize that atmospheres affect us, we disclose a tie between environment and cognition. This tie was analyzed by observing how the spatial organization of certain spaces can ease or challenge our cognition. I argue that the spatial organization could be considered intelligent when it simplifies our cognitive and physical tasks. Thenceforth, it was possible to ask, what could be an intelligent use of VR for architectural design? To which I answered, it depends. In this thesis context, VR should be used as a medium to support imagination. It can present another way of imagining, shifting a high demanding cognitive activity, the imagination and support of mental image of a given environment, to a cognitively less demanding activity, that is, the operation of the software and hardware necessary for the experience. Chapter 5, Representation and the Production of Architecture, Techniques and the Movement between Enhancement and Enchantment, presented the developments regarding presentation techniques since the 16th century. It was possible to understand how the efforts of Jean-Nicolas Louis Durand was important to, just a second, to define some of the limits that still surround the notion of design to the present day. Durand systematized the rules and procedures to design and represent architecture based on rationalization and efficiency. The pertinency of efficiency in designing was discussed as part of the process of disenchantment of the world. The arrival of computers in architecture office was studied, revealing how they changed the spatial organization and technical representation. The efficiency of computer-aided drawing enabled architects to produce faster and more precisely at the price of reducing the body engagement when drawing. Furthermore, the physical presence of drawings in office was minimized, implying that they are less available for sensory motor understanding. This discussion about drawings and computers was a fundamental step to understanding efficiency in an architectural design context. On one side, efficiency is desirable, and it is unreasonable to argue in favor of architects returning to draw by hand, for example. On the other hand, it is not possible to say that all this efficiency was converted into better atmospheres to be experienced. Durand's mécanisme de la composition unified in a single gesture creation and representation, establishing an invariant form of presenting what is being designed. The orthographic projections, plans, sections, and elevations forced a displacement of the architect's body to a safer distance from what is being designed. As I argued, Durand's approach to design established its domain, and the notion of the body is not included there. In this sense, the body loses its meaning as a reference for designing, and the architect becomes independent and subjected to geometry. Still, the body resists being excluded from the design domain, and it's left a reminder, its mathematical reduction or its representation. However, rationalization and efficiency cannot be condemned. VR, for instance, is a technology that depends on the computer's efficiency to work. So in a way, the process of disenchantment opens other possibilities for enchantment to experience a state of wonder. The immersion in VR can be experienced as enchanting, pointing that there is possible to be enchanted by technology. In this sense, the notion of atmospheres becomes even more relevant. They appear as an aspect of architecture that remains enchanted, that resists rationalization in the sense that the mathematical explanation and even the quantification of aspects of a certain atmospheric experience have little to contribute to producing new atmospheres. Designing can be either a process that is enhanced or enchanted, depending to some extent on the way one engages with designing. I argue that enhancing and enchanting are not opposites, but distinct approaches. Nonetheless, although they're not opposites, there is no way to consider that these two concepts are symmetrical. Our time's economic, cultural, social conditions force architects closer to the logic of enhancement. Computers can play a significant role in counterbalancing this asymmetry, and my suggestion of using VR to reintroduce the body in designing is an attempt in this direction. Thus, the body offered to the presence in VR needs to be measured and objectified, but the effects the experience has on the subject can be evaluated only qualitatively. The intended use of VR is thus closer to enchantment or its use as a medium. I believe that the importance of this type of use of VR relates not only to sensitizing architects to the subjective aspects of architecture and its effects on the subject, but also to make them aware that there are other ways of dealing with the technological aspects of the design process. Thus, it is possible at least to try to escape from a tendency to use technologies in the way they're meant to be used. The intelligent use of VR in the context of this discussion is to enable the production and experiencing of atmospheres. In the thesis conclusions, I try to explain why VR still has restricted use among architects. The production of the practice studies revealed how inadequate the software is for architects to develop immersive experiences in VR. It was not easy to learn to program in C#, learn Unity's logic, and solve the many hardware incompatibilities along the way. Furthermore, my expectations of designing more sensitively were occluded by manipulating sliders and adjusting variables that demanded new modifications with each new material or scene. On the other hand, this forced change in my design approach was crucial to perceive that VR can offer another way of engaging with designing. I believe that by engaging designing through a body in circulation, architects will be able to perceive how the relationship between objects, other spatial elements, and subjects change with movement, or that designing atmospheres can be regarded as designing the possibilities for unveiling objects from movement. In addition to associate design, movement, and immersion in VR, we can disclose how the immersion of that affects the perception of what we are designing, and something that seems organized when looked at from above as in a plan can be disoriented when bodily experienced. Immersion in VR discloses aspects related to the type of actions and their importance for designing. Although it is possible to modify the model while immersed in VR, depending on the software used, the importance of immersion for design is more related to epistemic actions than to pragmatic ones. By displacing her himself through VR, the architect can make the task of designing more manageable from a cognitive standpoint. And Kirsch and Maglio argue that some actions are taken not for the effect they have on the environment, as much as for the effect they have on the agent. I also discussed the possibilities opened by VR beyond its using for producing realistic simulations. The limits for these other uses of VR could be related to what I call the instrumentalization of architects' imagination, which makes it appear that the attempt to reproduce the look and behavior of the physical world is enough. I try to draw attention to other possibilities of using VR to create and experience what I call unlikely atmospheres, or the atmospheres that are improbable to exist physically. In a sense, VR enables the experimentation of atmospheres that are unlikely or impossible of existing within the system, either because they're not economically viable, or because they inefficiently organize spaces, or even because they're just experiments without any intention to be built. By studying the limits of using VR in architecture, it was possible to disclose how the question involved more than technology, comprehending also a structural limitation of architects' imagination. The totalizing aspect of the neoliberal imaginary, as Tozel and Casara argue, creates the feeling that it's impossible to imagine anything that escapes this supposed rationality. In a certain sense, we are immersed in atmospheres produced from this neoliberal imaginary, which can help to explain why it seems impossible to imagine alternatives to it. Architects are conditioned to produce from a disenchanted rationality, imagining and designing according to and for the neoliberal imaginary. Their production becomes part of this imaginary, influencing other architects' production to some extent, enhancing the system's functioning. In this case, to enhance the system is to increase its entropy or increase the chances of producing more probable images, atmospheres, and situations. On the other hand, VR enables the circulation of experiences among architects and non-architects, fostering discussions and inspiring the creation of other unlikely experiences. Architects can contribute to disclose little by little the spatial manifestation of the limits of the neoliberal imaginary by creating and circulating these unlikely experiences. The notion of designing atmospheres, which necessarily includes the body, can be seen as part of this invention process by offering experience at the body level. VR can help architects review and discuss how even the most obvious decisions in the design process are related to these imaginary limits. Finally, I reached the end of the thesis, writing with the certainty that I have a lot to explore yet. I am curious to understand the possible developments that will come from now on. In addition to experimenting with VR in the context of architecture, I intend to understand an activist cognition in greater depth, studying the similarities and differences of immersion experiences in different mediums. Furthermore, I am interested in studying if there is a way of imagining that is particular to architects and if and how it differs from other types of imaginations. Another point from further investigation is related to understanding experimentally if and how the idea of designing atmospheres can change architects' approach to designing. In addition, it can be especially interesting to investigate how VR can contribute to understanding and applying the idea of designing atmospheres, especially with undergraduate students with minimal designing experience. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Guilherme. And now we have Lorena with your comments and questions, and then Guilherme can answer them. Thank you.
Can you all hear me without like disturbances? Because I don't have a phone. Okay. So first of all, I would like to thank you for the invitation, Cabral and Guilherme, and also to be here with colleagues that I haven't seen for a long time and meeting other members of the Viva, so from the community. So thank you very much for the invitation. And at the same time, I think that reading your thesis, Guilherme, brought a lot of memories because I remember us in 2005 trying to develop stereoscopical images to discuss, like social housing in Brazil and what that would mean, and suffering with painting the wall with the right gray, and so sort of going through similar hurdles in different ways, I think. So it was sort of a nice sort of a trip into memory lane, and at the same time reading how much has been advanced and how I think passionately you have talked about it. So I think that's it was a thesis that was really nice to read in that sense, and it was also very easy. It was an easy writing to understand. There are some points that I will bring up, but I thought it was very generous, I think, because it was so multidisciplinary in a way. So I thought it was quite generous to introducing the different readers, let's say, to different topics that you dealt with in different ways. I have some paper here just to make sure that I'm on time. And Cabral, if I move too much, just let me know and stop me, okay? So what I thought, and of course, it's also very relevant to discuss that, especially from let's say the lens you come from, to understand how we can really use that to enhance experience and to focus on the everyday, for example, as we are always focusing so much, or not always, but there is a tendency of architecture to be so elitist and focus on, let's say, extraordinary architecture. And what does that mean when we try to bring technology back to the everyday production of architecture? And that's something that's very close to my heart, I may say. And talking about the everyday, I also like a lot how you bring everyday examples, or simple examples, to describe what you were thinking about when you were developing a concept or sort of moving through different fields, which I think it helps us understand where you're coming from and where you want to get at. Now I will bring some of the points that I would like to discuss with you, and I will bring sort of minor comments first, and then I'll bring the juice in a way after that. So one thing, maybe it seems a little bit stylistic, but the use of we and I, something that I would invite you to reconsider, sort of read through and see, because first of all, I don't see many we being written in dissertations in English, so that's also interesting to read one that's happening, but also because it's used interchangeably. So it's good that you sort of define a way that you're going to use the I and we and continue with that through. And another issue that I think that, especially in the introduction, I think there are some generalizations and very broad statements that other scholars have already been made, and you raise them afterwards. So it's more about bringing back the references, especially in the introduction. So when I'm reading your text, like I know where you're departing from and who are the authors that you're proposing to dialogue with. So for example, in page 18, you say, the gains brought by digital tools are hard to deny. What gains are that, for example, and who has already said that? Why are they hard to deny? But you know what I mean? Like, and you will develop that further on, but in the introduction, I find it such a special moment of the thesis where you're setting the tone that you should sort of just come back and get those special points. Or for example, when you say SketchUp became a preferred tool to draw models, where is it? Everywhere, or is it in Brazil, or how, right? Because for example, I haven't been teaching in architecture for a long time, so I wouldn't necessarily relate to that immediately. So it's just good to have that sort of to cover your grounds as well. Another thing that was a bit difficult to get, or not difficult to get, but something to think about, is a red thread for the reader. So when, especially in the first, I think, 2 chapters, it was not, the introduction to the chapter could be polished a little bit more, so I would understand why I'm reading all that. Where are you getting to? Because there is a very thick historical grounding of the different themes, let's say, and I'll come back to that. But why am I reading that? So, and when you presented here, for example, you were much more clear in that, you know, because you have to be short and concise, and that's maybe a benefit of a short presentation, that we have to rethink and be more concise. So just thinking a bit more, going back to the introductions of those chapters, to be more, yeah, I don't know, to sort of lure us into reading the whole chapter, right? And this is what leads me to, let's say, to the juicy part. So things that I would like to discuss with you. So the first one is it's how you frame and choose to explain technology, architecture, and immersion, right? And then you get a historical, or you frame it through different ways. For example, immersion, you will frame it from the experience of baptism. I'm not against framing it baptism. I just thought you needed to show it a little bit better why that is the moment where immersion becomes important, or how that becomes important. Especially if we're thinking about, let's say, dislocating it from the context that you're writing it about. What does that mean? And time-wise, why do you get the history, how you do it? You know, like, why do you start to discuss architecture from primitive architecture to everyday? So it comes across this thing of explaining the beginning of the chapter and what's the relevance of that. I can connect those dots, but it's nice if those dots are connected for me as the reader, right? So maybe that's a question. I don't know if we'll have time for you to answer, but if you have, why you made those, like, what was the decision to frame it like that? And then coming to the second point. So I don't know if I said I have 4 points that I'm trying to be brief about. Another thing that is quite interesting in your dissertation, but I think it needs a little bit of fine-tuning, is the discussion about production and experience. I think it's quite interesting, of course, also coming from architecture and having lived that process as an architect, but also being in the world, right? And living that through everyday experience. I think that production and experience interchange. I don't know if scale is the right word, but sort of interchanges the scale that you're looking at. So first, I was not very sure what you're talking about. It's like, oh, okay, yeah, it's production and experience as someone, as an user of the space, or as a user of technology. And then it's like, oh, no, it's about producing the space itself. Oh, no, it's about producing the atmosphere. So even though I understand that you want to go through all those different elements, it's nice if you tie them in a way that the terms are not used or the meanings are not interchangeable. But it's more, I think, about it's not about the content in itself, but how you present it, maybe. Because at the end, it becomes in the end, what I take from it is production and experience as an architect producing atmosphere, right? Which I think it is at the end your main goal. So we get there. It's just that it's a bit bumpy road to get that. And that will connect to another point I have in the further on. And exactly, I think then it becomes clear on page 222 when for me, it was like, okay, so that's what I'm going to take from it. So I don't know, think about that a little bit. And if you want to expand it a little bit afterwards, this relationship, that would be nice. And it was another interesting thing that I thought when I first understood, okay, we're talking about production of architecture itself, and then you don't bring neoliberal, or you don't bring, you bring the Capitalocene, but you don't bring that into architecture immediately. And then I was thinking, oh my God, but look, we are also, as architects, we are limited, right? We're limited by a series of structural conditions that shape also the way that we can, or the freedom we also have to think about architecture. And then you bring that in the conclusion, which I will bring, I think it's my last point. I don't think the conclusion is a conclusion, because I think it's just such an important, you bring so many important elements into the conclusion that I think it's a chapter, you know, like an important chapter of that. But then that's me thinking, you know, like reading, I don't know, 100 pages, thinking, why didn't he bring that? And then you sort of finally bring it. So it's about maybe hinting that will come at some point, because of course, it's not that you brought it at the wrong moment, but that you just left that suspense, and that was a bit, it was a bit suffering for my heart to do that. And I think that the benefits of bringing that in the beginning is that you set the point of the argument, which you're coming at the end, right? Which become a very important element as it, you know, like as you create the narrative, it sort of explodes into the discussion of what we can and we can't do, and how we may use VR to subvert the conditions that are limiting us, for example. So that's one thing that I think it would be important. And then it also, so for example, in page, I think it's page 45, you bring this discussion about the Capitalocene, and then you right after talk about Latour and how our experiences are connected to the environment, right? And that's where it sort of turned my point. Yes, I think it is connected to the environment, but when he says humans expand the environment by creating objects from what's extracted from it. What's like, who extracts what? Who has the condition to extract what? That you sort of bring at the end. So that's what I would like to bring, because it's also like, it's extracted, let's say, from a generic environment, but it's not necessarily my environment either. It's like, it's not that I am part of the production of most of the things I'm consuming anyways, or I'm engaging with. So it's sort of just bringing some nuance to that, which I find it's a very interesting part of the thesis itself. And then discussing immersion, I have another question that I didn't really quite get. This part of it's just a paragraph, but we don't have to engage with that right now, but for you to think about. So when you say in page 156, if we look at the nature of the stimuli before and after filtering, it can be said that there is no difference between them. Therefore, it could be said that the medium from where it emerges or emerges to experience architecture and VR can be considered the same. Since we're talking about atmospheres and immersion, what does it happen when we immerse or immerse from an immersive experience, and we're then immersing to something else, right? Because if we're in a VR experience, which we have been displaced from our environment or our spatial environment, what does that mean when I decide to cut that relationship and I decide to leave that experience towards another immersive space, which is the architecture as well? Or if I leave the architecture itself and I go to the city, it's another specific form of immersion. So that was, I mean, that I thought was quite interesting, but maybe to discuss a little bit more. My third point, so it's the conclusion, as I said, but it's actually before the conclusion. So I think once I finished reading chapter 5, I was like, oh no, so now it's conclusion. And it's missing this that you then bring at the conclusion, right? And so you say, however, it seems that a question remains. If VI is so advantageous, offering architects the possibility of working with atmospheres, facilitating communication of ideas, etc., why has it not become part of the architects' everyday lives yet? And I was like, that's not a question to leave open. I mean, like, of course, I understand you can't answer it, but then in the conclusion, you bring the elements that I wanted to be there somehow, not as a conclusion, as I said before. And then the fourth point I want to bring. Oh yeah, and another thing maybe that would be interesting that you could bring a little bit more strongly into the conclusion is why an activist framework helps us understand better or helps us work with what we have at hand. And it's more about just spelling it because you've been doing that the whole time. So it's like 3 sentences, as I think you brought a little bit more forward now in the presentation, as I said, for the matter of being concise, right? And the other point that you bring in the conclusion, that you bring in the presentation, that I think that's my last point, is the practice studies. I mean, like, yes, you're right. Like when I read it, I was like, okay, so what about it? You know what I mean? Like, and then you have this very large body of work. You've done so much, as you explain in the conclusion. So that should also come before of how complex it is. And you don't analyze it in the context that you're talking about. So why is it, how did it inform you? I understand that it did, but why and how? So I think this deserves a little bit more attention, and it's more about like what's already in the conclusion to be brought maybe beforehand and to inform us how these studies, they shaped the way that the theoretical chapters evolved, right? And do I have 5 minutes? Yes? Okay, so I just have other small comments that come from the big, or let's say the bigger comments, that you also bring mostly in the conclusion, the role of architecture education, right? And how architecture education also limits the way that we glimpse using technology. And of course, I agree to some extent, but it would be good if you expanded. I don't know if you would have space to do it, but since you brought it, it's something that I think it is quite relevant because it's part of these elements, right? So as we talk about how neoliberal framing of architecture production, for example, limits, education is the same, and education itself is also framed by a neoliberalization of the whole process, right? And how we have to become architects ready for the market, as you yourself bring that. And there is one interesting thing that I would like to tease you, because you say like we are not designing for we're not designing atmospheres, we're not designing for that, but we're talking about that all the time. Every time we have a competition, for example, the texts that explain sometimes the very simple and boring architecture we produce are very beautiful discourses of how it creates atmospheres and how it, you know what I mean? So there is some sort of a tension there between discourse that we also learn to do, because I remember me trying to explain my projects at this school, right? Using all these like beautiful discourses, and the project was not even finished because I didn't have time to do it. So it's like, there is that sort of reproduction of discourse versus reality, which I agree with you, VR could be a very interesting mediating or medium, or also a tool, right? As you describe yourself. So this nuance is something that could be really interesting to see in your work. And yeah, and then there is, I forgot now which, I didn't write it down. There is one comment at the end of one of your chapters, you will know better, that says, I suggest that intelligence use of VR should be related to its use as a medium to support imagination, especially in the early phases of design. I don't know if it was the 3 or 4, but what I felt is 4, right? I felt you brought that before you convinced me. So when I read, I was like, you know what I mean? Like, so if I'm not very, let's say, if I'm skeptical about what you're talking about, I will not follow through that argument. At the same time, this is something that could come in the conclusion, right? That after you described all that, then you say, you know, I feel that VR could be that tool, and I need to study that more. As you said, like there is like sort of room for further research. So these were sort of the comments I had. I don't know how helpful they are. Very passionate, I imagine. I even stood up to make sure that I had the whole theatrical thing on my side. But again, thank you very much. And I don't know if you want to, or if there's time, Cabral will tell us to, yeah, respond to some of these comments.
Yeah, thank you, Lorena. Very good comments, very good observations. I mean, I feel like I wanted to talk about the development of the thesis, but I'm not in this place right now because some of the things, okay, I understand why it happened. You know how it works. But I'll let Guilherme quickly respond, answer to those comments, Guilherme.
Okay, Lorena, thank you very much. Your reading was so, you know, precise in very points that were. I was also thinking. I think that's not maybe it's not too clear, and you were touched right this point. So the reading makes some questions transparent, and I think that's good. First, thank you for the comments about the English stuff that I need to change. That I think that's a point that I should refine for sure. I will try to focus on your comments about the content of the thesis more than these stylistic things that I took note here. You asked first why I adopted this framing for my thesis, from where I come and etc. Well, I think I have I think that I try to look at the origin of things. So I try to look at the epistemology or you know, like from where the word comes from, and then I was, oh, but baptism comes from that, and then this comes from that, and so the immersion is related to this and that, and so I was very interested in the words, and that's why I'm getting back to all these places and the illustrations that I bring. For example, the baptism is much more like a kind of a provocation than something to explain scientifically. You know, like for example, yes, we are immersed from birth to death, and in the Western world, we value so much this moment of immersion that we pick up our children and put them into the water to say that something good happens, and when it comes out of there. So the framing is, it's much more like that, you know, like for example, for searching for an origin all the time and going back to the words, and then this took me to these places. When you say about the production and experiencing, I was, maybe it's not too clear in my text, but I was talking specifically about the production and experiencing of these atmospheres in architecture and in VR. So it's like the context of production and experience is that. So I think you're right that it could include more aspects and for example, to discuss like this economic, social, and also educational constraints that we are under it when we are producing architecture, and also these other these other experiences. But I was referring specifically to that moment. You know, for example, I think I write this in chapter 3 or maybe chapter 4. There is an experience of producing the experience, and I was trying to look into this circular relation that I tried to talk about it. You mentioned Latour. I knew when I was citing him that I was touching spiky grounds, to say a little, because there are so many people who study here in depth, and I was citing him like, oh, and there's Latour. And you're right that maybe I have to touch these points a little bit more. And I would like to talk about a little about my conclusion. You were right. When I was writing the conclusion, it was becoming a chapter of like 30 pages. And then I said, hey, Cabral, I think I have a problem here, because my conclusions is opening up a lot of things that I will not touch. So for example, this part when I was saying about the neoliberal imaginary, it's like 10 pages. And so we're like, no, take it off. It's something for further discussions after the thesis, because it, I saw how important it's how can I say, it was an honest writing, like I found that at that moment, like at the end I said, oh my God, there is this thing that is super important and that I have to mention, otherwise my thesis will be incomplete. But I know I mentioned it very briefly and say, oh, this is very determined, but I just discovered it right now. So I've been very honest about that. So, uh, and it's interesting that you said something about that atmospheres as this element that I am suggesting we should work from it, and not as a as you mentioned, as a discourse to explain why we do the way we do, right? And I think that the we produce atmospheres. Do we like it or not? That's another point. But we produce it, and we are very competent in a way to use this when it is convenient. So when you're saying about a competition and the jury are other architects, will be very impressed when you say about these things, you use it. But when you're talking to a developer, you say no, it's numbers, calculations, and etc. So I think that atmosphere should be used for what it has as a quality, that is to include this experience in the designing process, this experience from a bodily perspective, to introduce this notion that there is a body that will move through that space, and that in many points the organization of spaces and all that thing is almost secondary if you don't include that body there. So I think it's a displacement of atmospheres from this discourse to a practice. I don't know if I make this clear during the text, but and lastly, about the enactivist approach, you're right. It was something that followed me since the beginning. I was very interested in this, and I am in contact with persons that study this in depth to understand a little more about it. And I think an activist is almost it fits so good with the notion of atmospheres, and it's the notion of affordances that is important also for my discussion, that maybe it should gain more relevance, and especially in the conclusion to explain why it is a framework to understand how cognition works, and by understanding that we can propose, I don't know, maybe or I don't know if propose, but at least to ground or to justify my propositions better. So I don't know if I answered everything. If you missed something, please.
Can I just make just one last comment? This idea about disenchantment, I thought was really interesting. And this is something that I really, when I read, I was like, why isn't it in the beginning as well? So, I mean, like, this is something that you say you're going to talk about. So you say in chapter 5, that's what I'm going to bring about. Mm-hmm. But I do feel that, and of course, that's seen in retrospective, right? And that's very easy to do that for someone that's just reading the work, not have done it. But I would say that if that had framed your research from the beginning, there would be a very good connection, even to the historic, like, because when you bring the histories, when I ask you why, it's not because it's not interesting and it's not, like, it's not something relevant. But if you have brought that from the perspective of disenchantment, or this tension between enchantment and disenchantment, and the historical conditions that frame this, that would that would make the chapter 5 like shine even more. So this is I think that's the style of of course the chapter 5 is where everything comes together in a way, even though, as I said, I think it needs a chapter 6, but I think that it's a good way that you use to bring the thesis together. So maybe have some lines in the beginning, like telling, like, be patient, I will do that, and that's going to be great. You know what I mean? Like it's a way to lure us into reading as well. So thank you for the responses. I think you did answer my questions.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Guilherme. Thank you, Lorena. Okay, now we have Catherine, and thank you, Catherine, for being here with us. Catherine has been to Belo Horizonte. We had a joint project. That's a friend and a fellow researcher.
Yeah, well, thank you for inviting me, and obviously I'm always really delighted to have any reason to join up with you with UFMG and your team again. So thank you for the opportunity. So it's a little bit noisy in the background. I hope it's not too disruptive. So Lorena's already picked up on some really important and I think some really interesting ideas. So I think we're all going to go, oh, actually, I was going to talk about this, and now I may talk about this. That's good. Yeah, so I think I should say thank you as well, Guillermo, for the work you put in, and for, I mean, there was a sort of real level of depth, I thought. I mean, you can see that you have really, I can see you've explored all the dark corners of trying to understand about the topic. So this is not a superficial study. You have really engaged, seriously with trying to understand. And it's I think just reflecting on it, it's a really challenging field because interestingly, my master's thesis was about VR and architecture, 1998, and I had to do the experiments. I had to wear a headset that was like wearing an astronaut's mask, and it was like wireframe. So 25 years later, we are a bit further ahead, but the literature isn't. So you're working with a really poor. I like to see Slater still. That Slater's still like a core literature, and so I think there's a gap in the field that you're trying to work with, which I can see as a challenge. So. Good for you for sort of pioneering and trying to sort of embrace that area. So one of my questions is, bearing in mind I can reflect back to 25 years ago when VR was like the next big thing in architecture, and here we are. It's why and I know you've put this in the thesis, but just to be nice to hear from you. Like, why aren't architects engaging with this as a not just a tool for designing, but as a tool to create spaces that we can experience? Assuming that built space can exist in both real and virtual. We seem to have this, like, I don't know why it's become. We might use it as a sort of they might use it for a client to sort of show off some fancy model, but like as an experimental space. Really, really limited work, I think. So that's one of my questions: is why are we still here? And I know that's not the subject of your thesis, but in a sense, that's the space in which your thesis sits. And then my second question, I might do what Lorena does and sort of just is it all right to do questions first and then let Guillermo respond, or do you want to break it up? What's the best way?
Oh, it's up to you, but you can make the questions and he will answer in the end.
Okay, perfect. So sort of following on from that question is, you use the terms virtuality and immersion, but I don't think you truly get to the point of what's the difference between virtuality and immersion. There are two. I mean, I know you talk about immersion a lot, and then you talk about virtuality as some way maybe to experience for immersion. And I noticed you showed head-mounted displays a lot, but if we think about immersion, there are projection spaces, there are lots of ways in which we can experience an immersive digital space that is not just a head-mounted display or may move between different types of space. So I think this comes back to this thinking around, the phenomenological or the cognition, the point where you experience a space with your senses or with, you know, with that difference between the world beyond us and the world in our minds, but also, you know, how that's created and how that's mostly what you're talking about with virtual reality is a visual, and the phenomenological is a much more of a sensual, like, you know, the senses or I know you've talked a lot about the bodily, so I'm just wondering, you know, do you think there's an opportunity to rethink what a virtual reality type experience might be in following on from my first question? You know, maybe I know in your art pieces you've played with some things, but yeah, so I'm going to do the same as Lorena. Have 4 questions. The third is, so I think one of the things that really does need to be cleared up is you move quite a lot between the idea of representation and experience, and you don't really distinguish. Like, you talk about the design of architecture, which is representation, and then you talk about the experience of the space as almost as and I think Lorena did pick up on this, but you know, the design with VR is an entirely different space to work with to creating a space to be experienced in an immersive space, and you slightly slip between talking about the two things in the same way. And I think particularly in chapter 5 I was a bit like, okay, you know, architecture representation tools, drawings, sketches, and how that moves into a virtual reality type design space is very different, I think, from the ways in which we would experience some sort of environment, you know, depending on who's designed it or not. Yeah, I think this links to, I mean, when you talk about atmospheres, you know, atmospheres is a term that they sort of developed in particularly in geography, which has been used to sort of move beyond representational theory. So I don't know if you did that on purpose, but you know, that's where it slips in again into this point where you're trying to look upon a non-representation, you're trying to move beyond representation to this post-representational you know, way to talk about things. And I just wondered, within that, you know, whether you could just be a little bit more knowing about how the term atmosphere, you know, how the fact you've taken that position of using the term atmospheres and how that maybe links to some of that turn from the phenomenological, from the sort of, you know, the singular the sort of representational approach to something more atmospheric, you know, experiential. And then finally, I was just going to ask you, really linking to my first point, is, you know, have you ever come across a project, I mean, I'm not your own because I think that's slightly different, but a project that achieves something of the state of immersion, or that creates this atmosphere that you sort of say is a gap, you know, because I reckon that you're totally right, there's a gap. But have you, you know, is there anything out there that you've come across that, you know, does it, because I you know, again, we went back to Osmose, and I was like, gosh, you know, Osmose was a reference to the 25 years. So, like, why, you know, is there anything you think more recently that you've gone, okay, this is nearer to what I think these sorts of spaces that you know, I'm thinking about. It's just be interesting to know. Is there something? So those are my questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Catherine. And Guilherme, you can answer.
Okay.
And Catherine, feel free to dialogue if you want to reply to him.
Okay, thank you, Catherine. Very nice questions. I will start by answering this last one about the possible exemplars that goes through this point of atmosphere. You're right. There are few examples that we can refer to, and Osmose is still the one, you know, like yeah, 25 years later, and we're still talking about osmosis, and there are a lot of people writing about it still today. And you know, the best experiences of VR that I had were under the gaming part of the world, the gaming applications. There are a lot of things in gaming that moves to a place that were not so common in to see. Like for example, when you navigate through the architectural environments in VR, they're so inert. I think that's the term. There's no vitality. There's this thing. You feel like you're moving through a haunted place. There is nobody. There is no movement, etc. And gaming has used this capacity of VR to present things in a more realistic is not the point, but I'm trying to find another word, like that moves you somehow in an emotional way. You establish an emotional connection with the thing that is similar in some points to what people related Osmosis was able to did in 1995. This is linked to, as you said, to your question, why VR is still the next big technology, the next big thing. And yeah, there was an article on Wired last month, I think, exactly with this title, why VR is still the next big thing. And people were talking about, for example, it is an industry that has millions and millions of dollars invested on it, and still there is not a lot of people using, there is not a lot of how could I say, it's not widely adopted everywhere, and the devices are progressively cheaper when we still have this, it's not getting traction, it's in a way. You want to say something?
I think my question was linked to that. Was more, why are architects not engaging? Why have we not treated it as a design tool in the way that? I mean, I know there's game designers doing, and there's there's nobody who's got spatial, who's got design. They sort of. I'm wondering. I mean, why? That was. I think it was more from not why is it not the next big, but why are architects not engaging with it more as a an equivalent design tool for spatial design?
Okay, I think that one of the possible answers to that is the lack of spaces for experimenting with VR. You know, like for example, when the VR is ready to be used. For example, I have a VR kit here in my house that is unmounted. Is under the box, in a box here, because, and I almost don't use it except from when I'm doing my experiments here, because you have to fix things in the walls, put things in the outlet, and etc., etc., etc. And so you think, oh, it does not worth it. So I think that's one point: the non-availability of the devices ready at hand to be used. And the second point, I think that's still a software limitation to enter and experiment with VR. For example, Habits, ArchiCADs, and other software used by architects, they have a link that you click and you go to VR, but you can't change things in VR. So it's like you enter VR, see a thing, take off the headset, move the thing, enter VR again, see it's okay. You have this kind of movements between VR, desktop, and other devices that I think it's also hindering a wider use of VR. I don't know if it answers you, but
Well, I mean, I know I've seen work. I know I don't want to get into the technical. I think not too much in the technical, but I know there are some software like the game engine platforms like Unreal where you can actually manipulate. You can sort of use the VR space as a way to manipulate it. So I think there's possibly there is ways beyond that, but I think it's because I think it's more than just the technical limitations. There's something about working in it's got different dimensions to it or different parts to it. But it would be interesting, I think, to have some of those reflections, not the technical, but some of those reflections maybe captured to sort of show why the field is sort of a challenge in itself still.
Yeah. There's a point that appeared when I was doing my practice studies that I did not discuss in the thesis, that I've tried to design something totally in VR, like for drawing the walls and etc. And it was so frustrating and so tiring, like, oh my God, I will take this out, do it in the PC and go back to VR, because it was at the same time that I was presented to all these elements and I could see them and change the dimensions there, etc. It was so limited in a sense, like I felt that I could work better if I had another distance from what I was designing that was not exactly inside the VR, the space where what I was designing. So that is a uh, thin line, you know, like it's difficult to say uh, exactly why, but I think that this is a suspicious that I have, that it's still very demanding, very tiring, and it's not the best thing yet to design in VR by using the actual software we have there. Uh, uh, I will try to move to your other questions if you, or do you prefer me to continue on this
No,
one?
no, that's
No?
useful. Thank you.
Okay,
Yeah,
okay,
you go ahead.
okay. Well, so the other thing about virtuality and immersion, yeah, you're right. I try to be very restricted to discussing immersion all the time, but you're right that maybe I should get to entering this term of virtuality, because it dialogues so much with what immersion could be. And also when you say about representation versus design and the versus experience. I say versus because I know you were not opposing them, but it's just uh, for my organization here. I think that when I was thinking about representation much more as an end than as a medium, you know, like a mean for designing. I don't know if it was clear during my my argumentation, but I saw that, for example, when Diron established the mechanism de la composition mechanism that, in the 16th century or 17th, he was unifying this gesture of creation and representation into one single gesture, and doing that, and by doing that, he was taking representation to another level. Like for example. At that moment, architects went from the construction site to the office and started to develop. They were mostly based on representation. And I think that there was something that was lost in this movement to this strictly representational phase that is related to equating design and representation. Like, for example, design uh, is representation today. We can say like that for simplifying, you know, like for example, there are so many, there are so little spaces for designing that are not related to representing, especially in the schools today, but at least in Brazil, I think. That we are very tied to this notion that a good representation may imply in a good design, which is not true. So I was trying to uh, look into these two uh, concepts separately. I don't know if I was able to do that. And it is in this sense that the word atmospheres come in. Like, it's interesting that you say that it came from geography, and I was thinking all the time that it was closer to this physical concept of atmosphere. That's something that pressures our body. I was having this as an illustration of atmospheres, for example, what exerts a force between quotes in our bodies. So, for example, atmospheres for me is exactly this uh, thing that escapes the what I call the rationalization that is proper to the representation logic. For example, I can't work with atmospheres properly if I am interested in setting the mathematical rule for understanding atmospheres and things like that. So the atmospheres came at this moment to show me and to explain that there is something about the perception of a space that is proper to the space itself, and it's not representable, and that's the point, that when in contact with a subject, it produces this atmosphere that is related to the perception of the space. I don't know if I'm answering you.
Well, I mean, so one of the challenges is if you take the argument that representation leads to the spatial, So I think one of the challenges with VR is it's almost entirely a singular experience. I mean, there's almost no VR which is for either for multiple ways to people to create it together, or particularly for people to experience it together. So it's you know, you're locked in this little world by yourself, and actually you are literally, you know, you are literally isolated from the world, the people around. You're not even connected still, you are more isolated. So I'm wondering, you know, but perhaps that's one of the, you talked at the beginning about the challenge with using the software, you know, it's like, you know, you have this battle with it. But if we think about some of the ways we treat design now, it's much more of a collaborative space. We do it with people who are non-experts. So
Yeah.
there's a real sense then, if VR does become more of a design tool, the spaces we end up with may be very singular, very non-collaborative, but quite maybe very, very highly experiential, quite, you know, basically spaces of our mind, really. So I'm wondering that, you know, maybe that's something as you go forward, something you could. I've always thought one of the real challenges for VR is not that we do it better, but we do it with other people. You know, because that's the bit that's missing for me. Is I want to be in a VR space meaningfully with others, you know, who don't, you know, that would be the interesting bit, really. So I'm wondering, is that maybe that might be something taking this forward that would challenge those edges of what design and representation, you know, what the link between representation and the design might be with VR.
Yeah, yeah. You're right. The experience of VR is usually very solitary. You're like isolated and etc. There are some experiences of trying to design things collaboratively, but even that, you know, you were interacting with an avatar or with a head that is floating in the air. It's not the same. So I think that some advancements could go in this direction, especially in the educational field. I think that if you have multiple students working together, they could talk and see things better if they are in that same digital space. But you're right, it is in fact very, very difficult to produce meaningful experiences in VR for multiple people. When you have one people is isolated, maybe under, for example, a gaming experience, it is very moving, but I don't know if you have like a lot of people working together in VR, if it is a really immersive thing, or it's like more a kind of a burden to be there and all that time, because, you know, the design is something that takes time. And if there is a thing that is not comfortable over a long period of time, that thing is VR. You use it for 10 minutes and all you want is take off the headset because your eyes are burning. So there is a sort of a challenge there too, I think. Do you think there are other questions that I should address to you, Catherine? I don't know if I answer everything.
No, I think you answered most. I suppose when I talked about this, sort of just linked slightly on. So when we talked about VR and immersion and like how you distinguish between immersion and VR and that moving beyond the head-mounted displays, again, this sort of potential of some of the things that you aspire, you know, this sort of atmosphere through. Do you consider that an immersive space could also be a projected space? You know, I suppose I think it might be that something I find really useful in a thesis is to have some definitions, and maybe just including some short definitions of what you term immersion, what you term virtual reality.
Okay.
You know, that those things might then unpack, because if we say immersion is an experience of some sort of digital space, you know, that could include all sorts of types of experience, whereas virtual reality, I think, at the moment is pretty much bound up in a head-mounted display. You know, that's sort of where the edges of it lie. So I'm just wondering, in terms of the way you talk about immersion and in the architectural design space, do you think that an immersive space could also include a fully projected space, or even, you know, what point does it become? How would you define the point where it becomes immersive?
That's a very good question. Well, yeah, when I was saying virtual reality, I was referring specific to the experience with the head-mounted display. Also, there's a discussion in the past, and many of the literature I had, especially from the 90s, they like consider, for example, desktop experience as a VR experience. Like that, there are many papers in that direction. But I was like trying to be restricted to the headset experience. Well, it's very difficult to say when a space becomes immersive, because immersion is something that is this moment where a subject is in a certain sense called by that space or by that experience, and he starts to respond from that experience. For example, I use an example in the thesis. There is I know when somebody is immersed in VR when you throw a ball at him and he dodges from the ball. That's the moment to say, okay, this guy is completely immersed. I don't know when architecture, what is the equivalent of this anecdote in the architectural space or in the physical space. I really can't. I don't know how to answer this question, because it's such a subjective experience that if I don't know if I can define that well. When the space has this or that characteristic, it becomes immersive. I don't know if that's the point, but I think you that's something that I probably need to investigate more, because what one can have, for example, an immersive experience on when visiting, I don't know, like his grandmother house, that is, like from an architectural standpoint, there is nothing there that is relevant, but from all the memories and from all the stuff you brought with you, it becomes immersive. So this is a challenge, really, to to define this point, but I think it is a sort of a predisposition, especially on the subjective side, to be uh, in connection. I don't know if that's the correct word, but to be entangled with all the sensations and etc. that and what it produces on the subject. And also immersion is like a it and also atmosphere. I say that when talking about atmosphere, that it recedes at some time. You could be immersed in immersion. For example, you are in a library that is very beautiful and you're very touched by that, but when you're reading a book, you could immerse in a book and then immerse to that library. So it's like this uh this yeah, it's a kind of a connection. I think that's the best word to use between you and that space, as a synergy.
Well, thank you. I've really enjoyed hearing more about your thinking behind the thesis and discussing some of these topics. It's been really interesting. So thank you for taking that chance to have that discussion.
Thank you.
But yeah, I'm happy to pass on. I'm not sure who is next in the distance in the world from Brazil.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you for your comments and questions. And now let's go to Fernanda.
Thank you, Cabral. Thank you so much for inviting me, Cabral and Guilherme. Thank you for trusting me with your document, with your dissertation. We don't know each other in person, so I really appreciate that you shared with me all this amazing research. Well, I must say that I first want to say where I'm coming from in terms of the comments I want to share with you. I am not an architect. I am a media scholar. I have a background in communications, and my research looks at media arts and mobilities practices. So in that sense, the comments that I'm going to share with you, although I engage with interdisciplinary research, they will come from a media studies standpoint. So have that in mind, and I'm not also suggesting any changes or corrections, or in terms of you should have done this or that, but I just want to bring out some points of conversation because the materials that you shared are so interesting, and they really triggered a lot of thoughts from my end. So first, I want to start by saying that I really appreciate how your dissertation has a very clear structure. I really appreciated how you start each chapter by providing us with a summary of what's coming next. That's really helpful to help us navigate a document that is so long, so we know exactly where you're coming from, where you're going to next. So, and I also really commend you on writing a dissertation in a second language. That is a very difficult task. And of course, there's always need for revision. There's need for revision if you write in your first language. So I really commend your courage and your willingness to do that. I appreciate also how you engaged with your research and shared with us your personal trajectory. What are your childhood experiences and how that ties in your professional becoming and your becoming as a researcher and as a scholar. I find it so important that we understand ourselves as researchers and professionals in ways that include our own subjectivities. I really appreciated that. Also, how your questions come from real world observations. And I will hear second everything that Lorena and Catherine already said. The burning question of why is it that architects are not using VR in their design practices still starts at the beginning from your own experiences, and then it comes back to haunt us in the end. Why is it that the architects are still not using that? And I'm going to here refer to some comments that Catherine just made, and I see reality TV shows in design that will use VR to showcase or to demonstrate to clients how a space would look if it were renovated. So and VR has been in the popular imaginary, in popular culture has been very present. I would like you also to think about, I invite you to think about how VR has not been picked up as much by architects, if it's related to the possibility, if that is related to the fact that it has not been picked up as much by the general public. When you look at AR and how AR advanced quickly in a short number of years compared to how VR has not advanced as quickly, what is it that VR enables us to do or disables us to do that AR might do differently? And what I'm thinking with that in terms of my main question is that what is the role, what is the place of VR in expert applications for architecture design, for example, but in general, what's the role or the place of VR in a current media scape, a current media ecology in which our attention cannot be colonized by one thing only? In a situation that we are always being demanded to multitask, to engage with physical, tangible objects at the same time that we are being engaged to, being requested to engage with data and visualizations and digital objects. What is the role of VR given this situation, but also what is it that it could do instead to become more integrated into everyday media practices? I don't know if you can hear this. My neighbor decided to blow leaves in his yard. Okay, good. It's very loud. If it gets too loud, let me know and I'll go hide in the closet. So the points that I want to share with you and open up for conversation, we'll then talk about more from a media perspective in terms of the relationships that you are establishing regarding how subjects and technologies are integrated, how we could view technologies as tools or technologies as medium, and you will talk about mediation, and also questions about methods. And as a scholar who does research in ways that privilege multimodal modes of scholarship. And I mean, by that, I mean that as someone who writes papers, but also builds digital objects as a mode of engaging with critical analysis, I want to know more about your methods as well. and how your practices and your experiments inform your theoretical inquiries. So right at the beginning, you comment, you share with us this anecdote of your childhood, and that comes back, another one comes back again with the experiment about the cut, which I thought was very interesting. And you talk about your ability to engage with digital things. And I want to share with you that Benjamin Peters, I'm not sure if you're familiar with this one piece. So Benjamin Peters organized this collection, came out in 2016, called Digital Keywords. And it's a glossary of keywords. It's inspired by Raymond Williams' keywords, published in the 70s. And he has this one, he writes this one entry called digital. And he is establishing an argument that is very similar to what you are making in terms of understanding in your efforts to understand digital beyond computerization, beyond what computers make, but more about the digit and the ability to count things. What I find him to be helpful in terms of helping you move forward with your argument is that he talks about how, and I see that how you are putting this effort forward in your dissertation in terms of discussing the digital and the virtual in ways that are not separated from real, in the ways that you're trying not to make an opposition, a binary between what a virtual is, what the real world is, right? So he's talking about the limitations of the use of the term digital as synonymous with discrete electronic computing techniques. And he discusses how digits do what index fingers do, which is count, point, and manipulate. So when he's talking about what our digits, our fingers do, he's talking about not our ability to just touch screens or push buttons in operating digital media, but also our ability, the ability that digits will count the symbolic, digits will index the real, and also once combined, rearranged, recoordinated, they can also manipulate the social imaginary. So I find that chapter, that one entry, very interesting because it might point to what is it that that VR can do in terms of not just creating reality doppelgangers, not creating exact representations or realistic, convincing simulations. Also talks about the possibility of the potential of data not resting only on the supposed possibility of creating predictive analysis or more accurate representations of reality. He talks about the ability of using the possibilities of indexing, counting, indexing, and manipulating as a way to engage with the potential of imagining more sustainable spaces and more sustainable realities. And I think that ties in with what Lorena was saying also in terms of what is it that VR can do. And I imagine Kaka, based on what I know from his research, would probably argue for that as well in terms of how is it that VR can be more in tune with not just conceptualizing comfortable in terms of highly technological, shiny spaces, but also in terms of imagining possibilities in situations of scarcity. So on that sense, it also when I was reading your discussion about the Anthropocene and the Capitalocene, it also reminded me of Donna Haraway's discussion of the Thulucene as a way in staying with the trouble, and how she argues for the role of SFs, speculative fabulation, science fiction, string figures, as a way to create an alternative vision of the Capitalocene. in ways that will also inspire us to explore, I think, the potential of technologies and VR in this case as a tool to design alternative futures towards a more ethical way of embodying this planet and other spaces that we occupy and how we relate to otherness. So these are just to give you an example. So my whole interaction here is not going to be in terms of asking you questions, but just more opening up venues for engaging with scholarship and a discussion that might aid in further developing and engaging with this struggle that we always have of trying to get away from binary thinking of, as you are doing, trying to think about the ways that subject and object are not separated, and how virtual reality and physical reality are not also separated as well. So with that sense, in that sense, what I noticed that throughout the dissertation, as you are applying a phenomenological perspective, there is this tension, right? And between how phenomenology, as much as it is trying to break from the idea of a Cartesian body, and also trying to look at what happens in between. And on page 157, right, you start a discussion in the beginning, but on page 157, you go to apply the concept of atmosphere as a way to focus on the mediations. You talk about the experience of immersion as one that's not objective or subjective, but it happens in between, like a constant, there is a codependency, like there's a constant reshaping of subject and spaces. Well, in that sense, I would love to hear more about the limitations and possibilities of phenomenology to be able to help you achieve this questioning that you have, that to me seems to be, as you are aiming for ways to deal with spatial creation, spatial experiences, and we're talking about physical experiences of architectural spaces, but also the body itself, right, as a physical spatial experience of a subject formation. So I'd love to hear more about what are the limitations of phenomenology in achieving this ability to enact mediation. And I see that at some points especially when you bring up Latour and STS, and you call for a more environmental take on how these experiences are being discussed and produced. So I think what I'm getting at, and this is coming from somebody who's trying to do more than representational discussions, and somebody who is very much who does a lot of Foucauldian and Latourian research, based research. So I am biased in the sense that I am more of a post-structuralist, or more of a trying to get away and looking at subjectification and as part of as something that operates in terms of agencies and ecologies that acknowledge that subjects are not even a unity to be considered, and looking at non-human components as things that are articulated and at some point create this evanescent passing and always transforming fleeting unit, but it's very temporary. So have in mind that then this provocation can be quite biased. That doesn't mean that phenomenological framework is not valid, not at all. But yeah, so I would invite you to think about how post-human approaches would challenge that perspective as well. And I want to offer also how this discussion of, and now I would love to hear more about the experiments themselves and how they inform your questions. And I was particularly moved by the first experiment. And I really appreciated the narration, the voiceovers, and the stories were so compelling. I could definitely see how the VR, the simulation, and how it translates, and it's complemented by the voiceover and the story. The storytelling was amazing. And the notion of the cut, the idea of the cut, I thought was especially intriguing. And when you talk about how your grandfather cut your, I forget how it's called, but you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, the tongue thing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that.
Granulum, I don't know.
And then you express how appreciative that you were, then that your mother let him do it. And the cut for me is such an act of violence. The cut is an act of separation. And there's also in the cut an appreciation, because it's disabling and enabling at the same time. So I find the cut to be such a powerful figure to engage with discussing the relationships between subjects and technologies, or subjects and otherness in general. And you ask, at one moment in that project, you asked, is VR a cut? Is it possible to digitally cut? And what I was wondering is, if we think, I would love to hear more about that. How is it that the digital, if we think about digital as a form of representation, then within that framework, yes, there is a cut, but which would be other ways of thinking about digital and the digit, going back to how we started this dissertation, that would recover the idea of a cut as one that's not a separation, as one that is more of a manipulation, is one of more of a reconfiguration. And I've also, in that sense, I also want to bring up the work of Misha Cardenas, and she's at USC, and she has this amazing, brilliant discussion of the stitch. And so the work by Misha Cardenas is in mobilities and feminist media studies, and she is a poet, she's a performer, and as a transgender woman, her scholarship is very committed to transgender rights and gender rights. And she's talking about how transgender bodies engage or suffer cuts as act of violence. And she's talking about how the act of stitching, which is still violent because you have a forgot the word. You have a thread going through flesh, but you're stitching and you're healing. So, and again, she's talking about ways that we embody our own physical bodies, and ways that we engage with other practices and actions to reorganize this body. And you are talking about architectural spaces, but given that digital mediation has become so pervasive, and to the point that digital ways of becoming don't really recognize frontiers or barriers, separations between physical, tangible, organic, and non-organic. I thought it would be interesting to look at her research as well and understand how and she's talking about how the stitch is a material and conceptual operation. And she goes back to discuss Deleuze's discussion of the fold. and well, Deleuze is going back to Spinoza to discuss how the fold, thinking about subjectification and creation as folding in and folding out. So those are, I find those to be such powerful ways to talk about ways of becoming that are tied with spatiality, spatial formations, and also ways of becoming, ways of embody that I thought would be helpful to bring to our conversation. So I would just make one final comment now, which is I really appreciated going back to the experiments. I thought the experiments are very, I really appreciated them. I thought they were very speculative, and they really push the concepts to the test. They put the concept to the test. I'd love to hear, as Lorena said, I'd love to hear more in terms of to see more in terms of the text, an argument to demonstrate that. So I would love to hear from you, how is it that these practices of speculative design, this speculative fabulation, and other current practices in design, like critical, technical practice, participatory design, how is it that these methodologies, how do you think they would make room for the design of atmospheres? And I'm using make room purposefully because we're talking about making space, but making space in terms of making the actual spaces that we can embody, but also opening up the discussion figuratively as well. How is it that why is it that it's so important for you to do those exercises? How is it that the speculative practices such as these inform your research in different ways than just going about a more traditional research method as well? So I'm gonna wrap up here. Thank you again for inviting me to this conversation. And I really enjoyed reading and going through your materials. Thank you.
Thank you, Fernanda, for your comments. There are several points. And well, I'll let Guilherme answer to them.
Okay, thank you, Fernanda. Well, I found very interesting that you recommended me Benjamin Peters. I don't know him, but when you talk about the digites, you're saying about the real, imaginary, and symbolic. There are Lacanian terms that I like very much, but I was not able to bring to the discussion all my psychoanalytical interests in except from the examples. The examples, I think, the practice studies, I think they're absolutely psychoanalytic examples that are from my experience, obviously. And I think that's a point that I could explore more, but I think find it hard to argue. For example, it isn't the two examples, the two practice studies were a way to open myself to others at the very end. It's that like this is what happened in my childhood. They're very intimate experiences, but they are formative in a certain sense. So one of the questions that haunted me at the beginning of the thesis was something like, why do I design the way that I design? Like this is a point that was before even my interest in VR and other things that I was willing to investigate, and I found that VR could be a very interesting way to create a room for to use your expression, for these limitations to appear. When you say about the cut, for example, that I think it is a very interesting thing, because we're talking about a cuts in the tongue. There in Portuguese is in the língua, that is the same word for language. And it is a thesis that it's not right in Portuguese. So there is a thing that is announced there is more profound than the examples itself, but the cut tries to show it. And you said about the speculative fiction based on Donna Haraway. There was another author that we are reading during the thesis, that is Anthony Doon and Fiona Raby, that they talk about speculative everything. It is a text that we passed through it, and my main interest in doing the two practice studies, and I find that they informed me beyond, as I told, this showcase of VR possibilities is exactly this involvement with questions that otherwise could not be spatialized. If it was not for VR, I would not build a building to say about my tongue experiences. So, this notion of the speculation for me is very important in what I intend to do in my work, because it is a way to move farther from the production of architectonic spaces from demands that will not come from the architect himself. For example, architects usually work with contractors, with developers that give architects a list of things that they need to accomplish, and the architect organizes that thing, and it's mainly that. So to say in a Lacanian term, the desire of the architect is not manifested truly in what he was proposing. So I'm more interested in these, you know, like for example, in working with these possibilities for letting these desires and these opportunities for experimenting with spaces that are the likely atmospheres there, right? Are more in the sense like for their point for the speculation. Like for example, they point to a direction where it is hard to find the space in academia or in professional life to develop this kind of experiments that I think they are very architectonic informing in a sense, because you have to do with a lot of architectonic questions there, illumination, sound, and materials, and etc. Even that these materials are all virtual and all these things are not don't have a material manifestation, but they're there, they're present, and they constitute an atmosphere that at the end you are influenced by it. So I think that there are subjacent or a low level, not low in the meaning that they are not important, but in the unconscious. I don't know if that the concept the correct word, but it works in this almost symbolic level of architecture that I think it's we are not usually aware of it. So to go talk about the methods, so it passes exactly through the same place. So phenomenology was something that I was very interested in, and since the beginning, just because it enables this possibility of including myself as an observer and as a participant observer of what I was doing. So there was a limitation in my research that is COVID, of course, that disabled me from doing experiments with my students and otherwise. So at a certain moment, I decided, well, I have to do it by myself, with myself, and that's the way we'll work. And I found it was very interesting at the end, because it enabled me to assess this other aspects of the production of VR experiences that I believe will be not so clear if I had delegated it to someone else, or you know, like this involvement with the research that I was trying to work with. I was trying to, I don't know, like for example, when I say it is naive at a certain moment that say, oh, I want to include myself in the research, so I will do these experiments with myself. It could sound very naive, very silly at a certain point, but I don't know that this is something that many researchers would be up to, you know, like to include yourself literally in the research. So I think my method that passes through this way, and I know that the difficulty of phenomenology is exactly this, especially when you are discussing, you are describing the phenomena that you are part of it. So, you know, like from a scientific point of view, maybe that may sound like, oh, it's not so much scientific, but I think that these observations could be, in a certain sense, they can produce knowledge to be used in other situations. So that's why I find that phenomenology is something that interests me, and I am trying to use it in my dissertation. So the potency of phenomenology is actually its limits also. So it is the same thing. So let me see. You say about the VR participating in a certain economy of attention. It is very interesting to note that yes, VR is super part of this ecosystem, but at the same time it promotes an isolated experience. Uh, as Catherine mentioned, at the other end, in VR, everything is a sensor and everything could be detected. So when you look at something, it could be detected. When you touch something, it could be detected. So it is completely under this economy of attention because it can provide a lot of information to be used in other situations also, in other devices and etc. For example, today, Facebook is announcing his platform for VR economy. It's called the metaverse, and you are going to produce things under their ecosystem of VR devices. And well, if Facebook is involved, it's hard to, to believe that it will be something that will not be used strictly under this logic of the economy of attention. They're interested in something in VR. They're betting all their coins into that. To I take this one step further, and I think that's very dangerous at the end. So I don't know if I answer, but
yeah, I wonder if VR is the same. VR for us is similar to the this dream of completely pervasive and ubiquitous physical computing reality, or this idea of our ability to create this sense of interconnectedness. It's something that we'll always be pursuing, but we will always end up, meaning that we will never get there. But in consequence of that, we will end up creating or engaging with alternative solutions, which is AR, which is having multiple screens instead of having one screen that colonizes our sight entirely. Same as the hoverboard or flying cars. It's something that we want to, another example that expresses our desire to conquer time and space. But that doesn't mean that they are going to be actualized, but we'll be moving forward, trying to reach that goal. But the post is always getting moved further away from us. So anyway, that manifestation of our desire to just become one with the worlds that we imagine and the worlds that we inhabit.
Yeah, it's interesting when you said about this desire that is moving further. You see, like VR is always under these the sign. For example, now they're talking about reducing even more in the glasses and etc. So at the end, the dream is like, oh, you have like just a lens on your eyes and everything will be projected, etc. If we think in VR from the lens of the Capitalocene and etc., VR is the actual final frontier when you can produce things in VR that does not use a lot of resources, like physical resources. You can market these things and you can produce an economy of scarcity under the VR environment. So it is a step further under the capitalist logic, I think. And for this reason, it's I think it's interesting to think on how to resist this demands of the industry and etc. to work with all these other things that I think are much more interesting, that are essentially from the subjective side. There is part of your historical things, your symbolical things, and the things that could not be appropriated so easily by those industries. So that's kind of that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Fernanda, and thank you, Guilherme. I think we could do a toilet break, 10 minutes. What do you think? Just to stretch our legs.
Okay.
Okay, we'll be
Sounds
back
good.
10 past 10.
Okay.
Oh, no, 10 past 11. 10 past 11 here in Brazil.
Okay.
All right. Back here. So, so let's hear, Daniela, your comments, questions, and thank you again for being here with us.
I have to thank you for the invitation and for the opportunity to be here with all of you, taking part in the discussion of Guilherme's Viva. So I will read because it's more precise if I read it than if I talk. So, and first of all, I'm going to make a context before I ask you some questions, okay? So your dissertation aims to study how VR can affect architectural practices, not only by what it makes visible, but through what it discloses and enhances, considering cognitive aspects involved in producing and experiencing architecture. Furthermore, it aimed it from a phenomenological perspective. You refer to experiences designed by you as practice studies based on immersion, personal experience, and poetics, in which embodied cognition, enacting, and the theory of affordances play a significant part. By choosing VR, you chose to engage in an intersubjective experience with another person through a medium, VR. And VR embeds a particular design by submerging, excluding one or more senses from the real world to emerge these senses in an artificial one. Your method, the qualitative research strategy adopted in your thesis, is based on an inquiry in which perception is seen as recreation and reconstitution of the world at every moment, that is Merleau-Ponty. It also presents a Heideggerian approach to technology, in which technology is a man or human-made means to an end and established by humans. And that's Heidegger. In this sense, technology is a mode of revealing. Technology comes to presence in the realm where revealing and unconcealment take place. That's Heidegger as well. Aspects related are memory as extension, cognition, ideology, context, alienation of human labor, and social factors as shaping artifacts and technology, environment, interaction, artificial processes, the Anthropocene, Capitalocene, and actor network theory. It also explores presence in action and embedded and engaged cognizer associated with immersion and immersive technologies. But one comment I have to make is, as Catherine and also Fernanda mentioned it, in the 90s, artists and architects and programmers were exploring the poetic possibilities brought by computer systems and elaborating theories on computational aesthetics. I also made some research on VR, but also in developing interactive installations by the end of the 90s and by the beginning of the 2000s. Throughout the 2000s, we experienced the upscale and expansion of networks, mobile devices, social networks, and of data science. The debate about control, surveillance, and data privacy systems took the stage. digital and communication technologies produced more subtle and modular control mechanisms organized in continuous flows. In an analogy to data flows in our current version of capitalism as flexible, instantaneous capital flows. In this new reality, relationships also become modulated by disposition and speed. Everything is fluid, takes temporary forms. Boundaries and walls between public and private, between home and institution, single and multiple identities are broken. And now other relationships are established. A thesis is done at home. The walls no longer confine. Students circulate in an enlarged virtual space with an intense speed of information clusters. Knowledge, in its volatile communication flow, is instrumentalized as an useful service. It should be noted that in Brazil, a battle is being waged within the scope of public universities in order to be alternative to a mainstream mode of knowledge as a commodity. Therefore, if 30 years ago, there was the freshness of multimedia experimentation in a spirit inherited from the Fluxus movement, experimental and conceptual art of the previous decades, the idealism associated with technologies as liberating and democratic changed. The revolutionary enthusiasm, like that of virtual reality theorists in the first moment, I have to mention here Jaron Lanier and Howard Rheingold, for example, they gave place to an approach that is at least careful, if not critical, towards the effects of technology, Likewise, while in the decades, as we have it, in the beginning of the VR experiments, as we have these devices similar to the prior ones, there was a prolific production of alternative audiovisual experimentations to traditional cinema systems, the idea of immersion and interaction in physical environments, installations, and video systems. They had been welcomed. After that beginning, as we know, there was a gain in scale, both in production and proliferation of audiovisual and interactive products. In other words, with the technological expansion, the artistic and technological experiments in the art technology segment embarked on the logic of the established audiovisual industry, of the emerging industry of interactive products and games, and of mega exhibitions and social networks. You successfully related the human inability to distinguish between perception and illusion due to our body structure, our anatomy, physiology, and nervous system, to how deceiving and therefore dissolving environment boundaries are possible. The presence-oriented section reminded me of studies done by the neurology team at Unifesp, together with the anthropology team at Unicamp, in which volunteers who were submitted to functional MRI, resonância magnética, should only imagine a red apple. Results of the neuroimage of the imagined apple showed almost the same narrow functional activation patterns as by seeing, that means perceiving, a real apple. It means that the experience of imagining a red apple was approximately perceived as real as the real apple. You also commented on a 3D digital model of an apple exceeding its visual appearance through the experience of experiencing on page 130. Both immersion in the data network and immersion in VR or AR systems update the phenomenological issue of perception, cognition, embodiment, sometimes leading to reductionistic theories, mostly arguing that in VR and AR systems, the human agent would be objectified, an expendable commodity. In a view mentioned in your dissertation, experiences are inscribed in our body. Phylogenetic and ontogenetic aspects are considered. The history of each person's interactions in order to maintain organization or reorganize, modulate cognitive domains. Inaction, enactment, acting emphasize that cognitive organisms generate their own networks of meanings in a world and mind performance based on the history of that beings in the world. Studies by Gibara and Pinheiro demonstrate that in the practice of exposure therapy with VR systems, in which patients are placed in virtual environments that simulate real situations, where the therapist can interact with the patient in order to reduce anxiety or social phobia, in which fear acts as the leading activated emotion, for example, brought better results than the traditional cognitive behavior therapy. It is important to note that neurological and biochemical effects on the limbic system, especially the amygdala, interacting with the hippocampus, reduce the feeling of fear and therefore have an impact on the memory of such feelings, prior experiences, and future possible experiences. A question put: by designing an immersive VR experience, what has to be concealed and what has to be revealed by using VR devices and experiencing the designed experience? I don't know, is that question clear?
Yeah, I think,
okay.
yeah.
Okay. I'm thinking about the intersubjective experience because it is the phenomenological approach, okay? My second question is, how do software and hardware devices and composition mechanisms, the idea of efficiency, enchantment, and your reflective conversation, how do they act in your practice studies? I go further. How do they act in your practice studies? Enhancing imagination. Okay. The third question is, what sets your studies apart from others? And what makes them different, novel, or outstanding? Here, I am suggesting something mentioned by Ranulph Glenville: computers as medium, as moderating and mediating behavior on one side, and acting to liberate us to creativity on the other. And the last question is, how do you see the future of architecture through VR in a broader cultural context? A comment I have to do. I'm not very familiar with your mention to the intelligent use of VR. Because if you have a phenomenological view, I can't put in this phenomenological view this expression of intelligent or intelligence. Okay? Thank you.
Thank you, Daniela. Okay, Guilherme.
All right. Thank you, Daniela, for the questions and the very comprehensive summary you did from my thesis. I think I could understand better what I did by hearing you talk about my thesis. So thank you very much. So I'll start first by your last question about the intelligent use of VR. It is a difficult notion to me also, because when you say that something is intelligent, you are presupposing there is some you attributing a quality to something that is particular to a subject. Like, for example, to say that VR is intelligent it's complicated. So the meaning I was trying to refer when I say intelligent use of VR is a little bit more closer to what Kirsch and Maglio were saying. For example, by using the environment to solve I don't know is that the right question, but to help or to ease cognitive challenges in that you were dealing. He uses the example of the mise en place, for example, that the cooker puts the things in order to don't forget what he was cooking and don't forget any ingredient, or even the supermarket example that I use in the thesis. So I think that you could approach this intelligent use of VR for many sides. So, for example, an architect that is working on a very big company and etc. I don't have any doubt that the most intelligent use for this guy was to use VR as the way they are already using for presentation, for convincing the client, because this is what is his ending, for example. So, but I don't think that this concept of intelligent use of VR that is closest to this architect is what interested me. I am more interested in this use of VR where you can focus on manipulating things in the digital environment to produce an image or to produce a space that will affect you, rather than trying to do this composition using just your mind. As you said, when in the research from Unicamp and Unifesp, there is a similar result in terms of activation of the red apple, imagine or present. And but I think for an architect, it's harder to sustain an image for a long time, to be working with that and to create this atmosphere almost just internally, in a certain sense, just through imagination. I think there is, through this process, and now I'm entering on your second question about the efficiency and the conversation. I think that is the process of design. It does not involve just creating a mental imagery, but to enter in dialogue with that creation to see what you were doing. So, for example, the notion of speculative, if we take the word to speculate about something, you need to have something first. If you think about a mirror as something that is at the roots of the word to speculate, so to reflect on something, you have to have something first there. So the architect needs to do that first drawing, for example, that first sketch on the paper to reflect about it. So I think that the intelligent use of VR goes through this place where you are presented to a consistent, coherent, and persistent space where you can take your time to look, to evaluate, to propose, and etc. That which be much more harder to do it just by imagination, and also just by representation, the bidimensional representation. I think the VR goes this step further. You asked about what conceals and what is revealed in VR experience. It's what I wrote. Maybe you formulated it better than that, but I just noted this. So I think that VR experiences is a very, how could I say, it obviously conceals the environment, but I think what is important in VR experience, it is that it reveals that the presence of the objects that are there in the digital environments have the effects of real objects. This I think is a point that is interesting. You know, like for example, when we're discussing virtual and real, digital and real, etc., all these questions, when you assume that the being presence of a digital object could have the same effect of being physically present with that object, I think that is something that is revealed that I think it's interesting in terms of understanding perception and cognition and etc. I don't know if there is something related to this cut that I told before about this concealing and revealing that I think it's interesting. That is when you put the glasses, the red hat on, and you get the controllers, you can also reveal how easy it is to be coupled with a technology. You know, for example, I was discussing this other day with another colleague that I think there is something that I am still calling a decision to be immersed. That I don't know if I will maintain this the long term, but that is something that you have to you decide at a certain moment that you will participate in that experience.
Yes, that was just the point I wanted you to stress a little bit, because it is at the same time it is submerging senses. So the person who uses the VR devices knows that I am submerging the senses. I'm going to engage with the technology, and at the same time there is an intersubjective experience there. And that was what I was asking you about. How is this intersubjective experience from the designer's point of view creating this connection to somebody who is experiencing it through this medium?
Mm-hmm. How is this intersubjective experience? Yeah, I argue at the end of the thesis that this maybe is what I believe is the most important use VR could have. Like, for example, I think that when you produce something in VR, you are revealing something about the place where you are producing. For example, when we're saying about speculative design, one of the questions that interested me is like, what is seen, for example, as a future for something in a developed country is very different from what is seen as a future from a third world country, or maybe even that notion of future of the third world country is a current situation in a developed country. So the circulation of these experiences, I think, can reveal a lot about this place where one designs. And if you open yourself to enter in dialogue, this could reveal what I'm calling the limits of the neoliberal imaginary. Like, I think we could not touch the limits of the neoliberal imaginary if not by producing these things and seeing how they are limited by this imaginary. Maybe the VR experience could be this place where you could give a body to say or to spatialize that situations that otherwise you will not even be aware of it. So when you touch this point and reflect about it, I think that's the main point of the intersubjective experience, and that points to the need for developing these experiences beyond just attending the market, doing things for presentation, and etc., etc., etc. So I think maybe that's the main point that I think are important. So another thing that you asked me about how software and hardware efficiency, enchantment, and
I'm more interested in how do you see the future of architecture through VR? You almost answered that, but if you want to complement something, it would be very interesting to hear it from you.
Okay. Well, as I said, I think that VR is the actual frontier from the capitalist thing. So I think that will be more architects involved in producing spaces to be consumed in VR. That's one main point. And I think that if we're still on the same line or the same vector of development, I think that VR will substitute, and to some extent it is already substituting the rendered images that by their time substituted the hand drawing and etc. So it's like a series of substitutions or enhancements of these techniques of convincement that ultimately are used to sell something and not exactly to dialogue. The images for architects, of course, they have this thing that enters in dialogue, etc. But they have a convincing purpose also that I think VR does this much more better. For example, the experience of VR is very overwhelming. So it's hard, as Grau says, that to have a critical instance, that have a critical position about an immersive experience because you're too close to it. So I think that from the most fatalist side, that the developments of VR and architecture will go in this way, like for helping to convince, helping to sell, and etc., to serve all the other forces that are beyond the architect's will. But at the same time, this presents a crack in the structure also that is when as these equipments and these devices and these technologies become more available, there are more space for experimenting with these other questions that are not allowed to be present in this logic, that I think that the subjective things that reveal the limits of the imaginary, the neoliberal imaginary, and so on. So I think it's more like this way. But again, I think the most probable thing is that we will be using VR it is intended to be used to produce more things, to be sold, and etc. But I think architects will be more present in these digital environments as soon.
Okay, Guilherme, I thank you very much.
Thank you, Daniela.
Thank you, Daniela. And now let's go to the last one. It's always it's a privileged position, but after 4 very good comments, and let's see what you are going to complement, Kaká.
Yeah, as you said, it's a privileged position, but also a bad position, I think. Well, again, I want to thank you, Guilherme and Cabral, for inviting me to this moment. Well, as you said, Cabral, many of the questions I would have already been asked by colleagues and comments, and I agree with several comments already made, which allows me to go directly to some points on which I would like to hear a little more from you, Guilherme. I will read, as Daniela made, and some questions Daniela touched, but I think there's little differences related to these questions. First of all, I would like to highlight the quality of the study, the magnitude of your investigation. I think you combined important references to think about immersion, architecture, as well as the question of VR. I think in all chapters, you were careful to highlight possibilities of VR, but also problems and areas to be explored. And finally, I think it's quite important to bring phenomenology as a methodology to discuss the concepts you are working with. Even with the limits, you updated some aspects discussed by Merleau-Ponty. And well, as Merleau-Ponty is a background for me, I think it's quite important, and I want to mention this. Having said that, I understand that the concepts of atmosphere, medium, body in circulation movement, and the design of software and hardware for VR are the focal point of your work. And from these discussions, you suggest us some other questions. The first one, to me, concerns to the efficiency or enhancement pair. According to your text, what we are witnessing is a trend towards enhancement, as you said, for economic reasons and for the very idea of the neoliberal imaginary. We are experiencing, as I used to say, a desert of the real or a desert of imagination, especially in Brazil in this moment. And you suggest that architects should take a different stance in using these VR tools or these references or these digital tools. My first question is related to this proposition. Wouldn't it be a case of rethinking the design of digital VR tools as well? Well, okay, architects should take another stance to, or another point of view, but the design of these VR tools is not a problem as well. Wouldn't they be contaminated by the idea of an enhancement, even when they present several possibilities of enchantment? Because I'm asking this because we are discussing the problems or the questions brought by the Capitalocene. And we discussed this, but I think we always put the solution in the individual or in the individuals. But there's a question about technology and all the context related to this. And I think this is the problem of neoliberal imaginary. It's always persons is always the problems. And I think this is the desert of the real. So this is my first question to you. A second question, you suggest that the body movement should be explored further in VR design projects. That would be a way of producing the idea of atmosphere, if I understand your work correctly. What kind of atmosphere is the atmosphere of enchantment? Was it something about a delay in space, staying in a space, a kind of, how can I say, to be in a space for a long time? Is the act of cognition related to understanding the space, or is it connected to being surprised by the way the atmosphere presents itself to the one who develops it and to the one who experiences it? A third question, and almost the last one. A third question would be, could VR help us to explore other boundaries to talk about what we understand as a space? I'm asking this because you brought works that explore closed spaces, but also spaces whose definition is given by the very act of exploration that the body performs. In other words, can we think of VR as a way to intensify the connection between architecture and other fields of knowledge, such as human geography, cartography, or art, for example? And I say this as a conceptual framework, not to design spaces exactly, but theoretically. How can we think these connections? And finally, you bring the idea of a neoliberal ambience education system, imaginary, and at the conclusion, you suggest us to think about the educational change or educational system. And I was wondering whether we should fight against this neoliberal logic only from the point of view of educational system. Because let me see if I'm explaining correctly. Because to me, it's the same thing to say, well, let's kids change the future, because the future is made by them. When we think about the educational system, and not an educational change, but the educational system, it is permeated by this neoliberal imaginary. So we will put the pressure only in this point, or we have to think about an educational change as well in economic, social, cultural aspects, especially in countries as Brazil. Well, as I said, and Cabral said, it's a privilege and it's a bad position. Well, this is my questions, and I want to thank you, Guilherme, because your work is quite interesting, quite provocative, and I think you made an immersion in these concepts, a profound immersion in these concepts, and it's quite good to read your work. Well, thank you again.
Thank you, Kaká. Guilherme, your comments?
Okay, thank you, Kaká. It's very kind of you to bring all these questions. Well, again, I'll start answering by the latter one, whether we should fight the neoliberal system from the educational, just from the educational side. Yeah, I don't think so, but it's interesting because, for example, there are questions, there are more, that are harder to touch in this aspect. For example, architects, when they study architecture at the university, they graduate and then they are allowed to practice architecture. It's an authorization. So it is hard to move farther from all the things that the market wants you to do, because you have to develop several competencies that will authorize this student to be an architect in the future. But well, if you think the very notion of forming or someone to be a professional that will actuate in some places is already very contaminated by this idea. But I think that it is a fight that should be that must have multiple fronts. For example, we need more literature, we need more movies, and we need more other cultural productions that will tackle this problem from many sides. And it's interesting, for example, this very notion was already appropriated by, for example, Netflix. Netflix was producing a lot of things against capitalism, against neoliberal imaginary, etc. But you're watching Netflix, you're paying to do it, and etc. It's a commodity, etc., etc. So there is why the system is so ingenious, because when you propose something that probably goes against it, it takes it and use it for its own benefit. So I'll try to go to your other question, if you don't mind. What are the atmosphere of Enchanted? And that's an interesting question you've said about the surprise or to be connected to that space. I think that this space of the enchantment is a space with resounds something. Like I think about that phenomenon where which resonates. That's the word, which resonate with something. So it's not a space that is devoid of any symbolic thing. It is a space where the symbols, and I'm not saying the symbols in the sense that they're decoration. It's symbolic in another level. And when the symbolic stuff are organized or manipulated in a certain way that they produce a certain movement, as a certain, it takes you out of place. For example, uh, when you go to an exhibition of architecture decoration in Brazil, people are very familiar, for example, with the exhibition of Casa Cor. Um, it's very hard to say that these environments touch you or that they resonate in you. They're like devoid of the symbolic connections, that place where there are things there that you recognize, and that recognition makes you more in touch with what that space is. When I was talking about the enhancement and enchantment, I was thinking a little about these possibilities of connection. For example, when we're talking about multi-user, not a multi-user, but when you apartments, high-rise apartments, uh, they are at the beginning all the same. They produce the same atmosphere more or less, because there's a difference of height, etc., but more or less the same atmosphere. But by introducing elements that are personal and etc. in that place, you can produce something there that will resonate with you, and that you create a certain atmosphere that will give conditions for you to perform your life in a certain way better, for example. And I think that the conventional architectural design not always do this, that there's not always a space for these personal elements that are symbolic for you, etc., to be there, and to establish this atmosphere of enchantment. Uh, when you say about if VR could be used to explore other boundaries, what we call spaces, and also you mentioned about the limitation of the very tools of producing these atmospheres. That was something that you brought in the qualification Viva also. Yeah, there is this limit. Of course, it's very present. As I said, I was expecting to design spaces more sensitively, and at the end I was programming x equals 0.000f. You know, like that there's there is a certain romantic view of that. This would be much more poetic than in fact it was. It was much more like writing equations, etc., to produce that thing. So yeah, there is a limitation of the tool, because these tools are produced to be used by persons who have this reasoning very deep and very entangled in them. Like, for example, computer scientists, people that are used to programming and to mathematics and etc. So these are their things. But I think architects should pick up this as a task for us to do. Like, we need to produce our own tools in order to access these other specialities. There are experiments in VR. They're taking this notion of space, so they're working with this notion of spaces more or less like you mentioned. There are some experiments with empathy and empathetic situations. For example, simulating what is the context of a refugee in the country, etc. That somehow it touches this notion of a certain space that it is simulated, but it's based on a situation that is not, that we from this side of the world in our context are very unlikely to experience, but we could be sympathetic to it. We could experience and in a certain sense be have some kind of compassion or at least to be aware of what is happening with other person. That VR could give this this expression and this place for these experiences to happen. So the notion of enchantment I was talking about, it came to me when reading a book about the Afro-Brazilian religions, about Umbanda, and that Umbanda is this religion where everything has a symbolic meaning. So the trees are a manifestation of something, the water is a manifestation of that other something. And I think that our reasoning, the reasoning of enhancement, is more interested in saying, what tree was that? is that leaf, is that flower good for this or for that? And are not very interested in that other aspect of the tree, that is how it affects, what it could bring, and what it could symbolize. So I think I passed it through these ways. It is not very present in the text, in the sense that I'm not saying about this, where these references come from, but they're there. And my interest in enchantment is like that. It's not exactly to say, oh, it's about magic and we should discard scientific reasoning, but no, I think that behind the scientific reasoning, behind all this the thing that we are immersed in, that there are part of this neoliberal imaginary, we like it or not, there are other possibilities for meanings. And maybe that's what the enchantment points to, for me at least. I don't know if I answered all of your questions.
Well, only the first one about the, if we have to think about the design of VR tools, if they are not contaminated by this neoliberal imaginary, or saying in other words, it's not a work only to the architects, but to the people that design these VR tools, because I think they are made to produce enhancement, not enchantment.
Yeah.
And I think this is the problem. This is a big problem. This is the problem with this interface right now. We are here to produce efficiency, to produce speed, to produce velocity, and not to stay together. To stay together is a problem in digital. And I think this is a big problem. And I think this could bring us to a separation, between real and virtual that is very problematic.
Yeah.
But that's it. It's the only question that I think we will not talk about too much.
Okay. So I'll try to complement it. So yeah, I think you're completely right. The tools are used to produce and to produce faster. For example, Unity, that is the tool I use it has what is called the asset store, where you can find pieces of the other gaming or other experiences to use into your own. Oh, there's a double side of it. So it could take you to places where you're not be able to be, because some of these assets have a very complex programming thing that you take a lot of time to arrive there. But at the other side, of course, as you touched it, you were much more closer to this logic of efficiency and etc. There are, of course, efficiency, the efficiency mentality, the efficiency mindset is present in the design of these tools. But I think there is something on the part of the subject that needs to approach these tools with another expectation. I don't know, but you were saying that, yeah, I'm getting caught again in the trap of the neoliberal imaginary. That is, I'm saying that the problem is the subject and not the tool. So probably you're right about saying that we should invest in the design of these tools as a collective, probably a collective activity to see exactly what are those points that need to be to be organized and to be put together. For example, if you look at, there is a software that is very interesting in this direction. That is the Blender. There is a 3D modeling software that is open source and is community driven, etc., etc., etc. And today it is as good as or better than the commercial software such as 3D Studio Max, etc. And so I think if we could be able to develop something in the same direction, it would be great. But it is also very difficult to think how these tools will not be appropriated for the big companies. For example, SketchUp, that was a very small firm that developed this tool. When the architects started to using it, suddenly Google came and said, "Oh, sorry, this is now mine," and took it out of the hands of that small group that was developing the thing. So it is a hard thing to do, but I'm sure we should be be dealing with the design of these tools. Maybe it is the displacement that you were suggesting that is important to move the thing from the side of the subject, from this collective more and more impactful at the end than just concentrate on some subjects and their role.
Thank you. Quite
Thank
nice.
you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Kaká. Thank you, Guilherme. Well, I don't have many comments, but I just like to thank you all and say I'm always in these juries, in this committee, I'm always impressed as how we collectively produce knowledge in these discussions. It's wonderful. I think man, we could keep talking and keep discussing here for ages. It's wonderful. That's what academy should be about. And it's hard to manage this time and this kind of meetings, although we try. I mean, there are too much bureaucracy usually. But I think, I mean, you all raised very interesting questions. Some of the questions we bumped into them during the development of the thesis, and because I mean, one thing is the final object, the other thing is the development, as you all know. And the reason, the conclusion is, okay, the conclusion is that is where he he arrived after doing the research. Yes, I mean, that's a point. Okay, that's where you should start your research now. And there's always this problem. But I quite feel, I feel, I mean, I have the same feeling as Catherine put, like we are talking about it 25 years, I mean, because in the 90s, I was doing my PhD and I was talking about VR and I was already frustrated with the applications to architecture. And then said, okay, now, the first time Guilherme came to me and said, but are you sure you want to do research on VR? I mean, I can't see the point of and my frustration, I think, when Kaká, Daniel, I mean, we all point to this. I think one of the questions is really how the tools were designed and the departure point of designing these tools. I mean, they were not architectural, or I mean, they were designed with this idea of individuality or an individual perception, and it's one basic thing of architecture. It's social. It's about interaction. It's about connection. So I think that's a really difficult point, and I don't see how we are going to overcome it. And because I mean, you have wonderful experience like Osmose, like Laurie Anderson experience, but they still very much focused on one person. But another question I just would like to point out is about the supervision of Guilherme. For me, it was a kind of psychoanalytical experience. I was pushing him, because I mean, I've known Guilherme for a long time. He was my student, then my colleague, and he has these two sides, and he has a hard side and a soft side. And when he came to me with these things, these very personal descriptions of his experience, like Fernanda said, I mean, I was amazed. God, this is really something you have there, talking about the cut of, I said, that's, I mean, it's total intimate, total meaningful. And if you can connect, so I kind of pushed him to bring it and challenged him to do something with that personal account. And I was surprised he had the courage to bring it, because I mean, it's like you are open your personal life in an academic work. And And as Fernanda pointed out, I mean, some of the questions were like simply the idea of cutting. There is a potential in discussing and taking this further and further to open very theoretical questions. I must say that I'm kind of frustrated. I wanted more and more, but that's the rule of the supervisor. So, no, you should go further. You should go deeper. There's more juice there for you to bring to us. But I was very happy to have pushed him in some directions that I think he wouldn't go. I think that for me that's the most important thing. To open new questions, new avenues for him to investigate, and so I'm quite happy with that. Although I'm frustrated with some aspects, but I mean I'm happy you took the challenge. So that's it. And I'm really happy with all the discussions and the analysis all of you brought. I only can thank you very much. It's different points of views and different ways of analyzing, and I think it was a very fruitful session. If you have any other comments, I mean, to finalize, then we will go into our private room in the Zoom, the jury, and we can deliberate. And so if you have any more comments, I mean, feel free to do it now. Okay. Then what we will do now, I will open a breakout room, and we can move there, and we can discuss, and then we come back. Guilherme, if I don't think the recording will be recording the breakout room, but just in case you